Now on BBC News, your daily briefing on business and economics from the world's financial centres. From new broadcasting house in London, World Business Report.
Live from London, you're with BBC News. Black gold, the oil giant Shell beats its own forecast with $9.65 billion of profits in the first quarter. Rate hike number 10, the US Federal Reserve raises the cost of borrowing again to a 16-year high, but has it finally done the job of taming inflation? Plus, deserted by a changing economy, the towns and villages in rural Spain that are battling for survival. A warm welcome to the programme. I'm Sally Bundock and it's now time to focus on the top business stories, and we start with the oil giant Shell. It has joined its rival BP in significantly beating its own company-issued expectations, reporting a 5.7% surge in earnings in the first 3 months of this year. Shell made a net profit of $9.65 billion, which was slightly lower than the previous quarter as energy prices cooled down. Well, let's talk to Naeem Aslam, who is Chief Investment Officer at the financial research and trading house Say Capital Markets, based in London. Let's get your first take on the numbers now they've just come out.
Sure. Thanks for having me. I think a lot of that is to do with the tailwind that we received in the previous year in i.e. commodity prices. But of course, if you drill down into the numbers, you can see that the trading house in-house trading revenue is pretty good. The margins on chemicals are again good. Optimizations of number of businesses have been done. But I think for me, the area which stands out the most is the capex investment, and that still stands in the tune of 26 billion. Now, what we want to see from Shell's perspective is that this is the prime time for companies like Shell and BP to invest in renewable energy space for two reasons. Number one, we have bumper record in terms of profits, and the second and most important one is the tax breaks.
So in terms of that strategy, of course, we all want to see these companies investing in the future, in a greener future for us all. But how has the war in Ukraine, the conflict there, changed that strategy for Shell, for BP?
So these companies are still very much committed, but the narrative is changing, as we were discussing earlier. So they don't want it to continue at the same pace that they were anticipating, or they were hoping, or they were doing that previously. And I think that is the area that investors are very much focused on, because with the limited amount of fossil fuel, as you correctly pointed out, everyone wants to see more investments in the renewable space. So this is the prime time. And the war in Ukraine, of course, the prices have cooled down. Commodity prices, especially Brent oil prices, they are no longer at $128. They're trading at $80 handle now, with the potential and of a recession. So traders and from investors' perspective, renewable energy is the investment space that we all wanted to see these companies to perform quite well.
OK, Naeem Aslam, thank you again for your analysis and reaction to the news from Shell that came out in the last 35 minutes. But now let's go to the United States, where the central bank, the US Federal Reserve, has raised the cost of borrowing for the 10th time. The 0.25% rise puts the Fed's main interest rate at between 5 and 5.25%. That's the highest for 16 years. But has it done enough to tame inflation? Or, with banks struggling and recession looming, has the Fed gone too far? Our North America business correspondent Samira Hussain finds out in New York.
Inflation remains stubbornly high. To try and get the cost of living back down to more normal levels, the Federal Reserve, America's central bank, has raised interest rates 10 times in a little over a year. And now it seems it may be ready to perhaps take a pause.
The committee will take into account the cumulative tightening of monetary policy, the lags with which monetary policy affects economic activity and inflation, and economic and financial developments. We will make that determination meeting by meeting.
The rate rises have slowed economic growth in the United States by making it more expensive to borrow money. and inflation is starting to come down. But there have been some unexpected knock-on effects of the rate hikes. They played a part in the banking crisis, where 3 banks collapsed in less than 2 months. So far, the Fed has been successful in slowing the economy and prices without plunging the country into recession. But the trickiest moment may have arrived. At some point, policymakers have to decide if they've done enough to keep inflation falling while leaving the economy with enough monetary space to keep expanding. They didn't think they were there at this meeting, but it seems likely that they'll be there soon.
That's Samira Hussain. Well, I talked to Ed Price for further analysis. He is principal at the business consultants Ergo Intelligence. I asked him if he believes the Fed is doing the right thing to raise rates this time.
Yes, it is the right step to take if you're worried about inflation, but inflation is only one of 3 things that central banks are currently worried about. So, of course, inflation is higher prices. That's bad. But there are 2 other worries, as I say. That is financial stability, whether or not banks and financial markets are doing what they should, and then employment. Can people get jobs? So yes, the Fed has done something that I think economists broadly think is a good idea with regard to containing inflation, but it might be that this decision also causes further distress with banks and financial markets.
And we'll find out in time about that, because once again, we saw a huge sell-off for certain banks on Wednesday on financial markets in the US. The policymakers were unanimous in their support of this decision this time to raise rates to the range of 5.25%. Now they're hitting the pause button to see the impact. What do you think the next few months will look like for the US economy?
Most economists expect some sort of downturn or recession. The definition of a recession in the US is somewhat subjective, but I think it probably will be a recession, and it will be a mild recession if the banks and the financial markets aforementioned can maintain a general level of stability. Again, Jay Powell said yesterday that it's not entirely clear what the influence will be of a above 5% interest rate, Fed rate. It might be, again, that some banks are exposed to interest rate risk. You may see some banks in trouble. If that happens, there will be a much deeper recession in the US.
How sticky will inflation be, though? That's the concern, isn't it? Because that's where Jerome Powell's focus has really been, on that level of prices, and the worry that if it doesn't come down quickly enough, how then will they tackle this?
Well, I'll tell you a secret, Sally. Economists don't really understand inflation. We like to pretend that we do, but we don't. I was one of the economists that said in spring 2021, I think, that I thought inflation might be a problem. Who knows if that was really just a lucky guess? Inflation is something that we only really understand once the data comes in. It's an ex post phenomenon. That's why the Fed says it's always data-led. If you want my guess, I think inflation will remain quite sticky for the rest of this year and into next.
Because some are predicting, certainly here in the UK, where our inflation is still double-digit, that it will come down significantly with energy prices falling significantly as this year progresses, etc. So it will naturally just reduce quickly. But many are looking at that and thinking, you're wishful thinking, aren't you?
Double-digit inflation is a major problem, Sally, because of a thing called expectations, and that does exactly what it says on the tin. Once inflation is at 10 or 11%, people expect it to remain there, and if not, to get worse, and that affects the real behaviour of people who set prices in your local shops and in larger chains. So 10 or 11% in the UK back at home is a big problem, and I would expect that to be a longer, harder problem than the 5% that we're seeing in the US and even the 7% that we're seeing in the euro area.
Ed Price there with his take on the Fed. Let's stay on interest rates, because households and businesses across Europe will almost certainly be facing higher borrowing costs today. The European Central Bank, which sets monetary policy for the 20 countries that use the euro currency, is widely expected to raise its main interest rate in the next few hours. I talked to Fiona Cincotta about this. She's from City Index in London. I asked her if the ECB will go ahead and raise the cost of borrowing again today.
Yes, I think the simple answer to that is yes. We've had some data from from the Eurozone regarding inflation this week. And inflation in the Eurozone remains very sticky. It actually ticked higher to 7%. And core inflation, which is the one perhaps that the Eurozone follows more closely, which strips out more volatile items such as food and fuel, just ticked very slightly lower to 5.6 off the record high. But still, it's well above the ECB's target 2% rate. The big question is going to be, will it be a 25 basis point rate hike or a 50 basis point rate hike? And we're thinking with growth at sort of 0.1%, so really starting to, or very stalled in fact. And also we've seen that credit loan demand and lending has really tightened. There is probably a larger chance of a 25 basis point rate hike today from the ECB.
And it's a tricky job on the part of the ECB because it's so varied, the economies, that share the euro currency, comparing Germany to, say, Italy or Spain, what their needs are very different.
Completely. And I think that was really highlighted in that inflation data that we saw on Tuesday. You've got somewhere like Luxembourg, which just has inflation of 2.7%. And then you've got Latvia, which has inflation of 15%. So, there's a huge difference there. And as you said, you've got then within the economy, the Eurozone economy, you've got very service sector focused economies and also very sort of economies that are very much focused on manufacturing. So, a very, very big, diverse range that the ECB has to contain.
And Fiona, before you go, we've got the Bank of England meeting. They're meeting next week. Of course, all eyes on the UK Central Bank, given the fact that our inflation is so high, our economy is stuttering. We're expecting another rate rise, I assume.
Yes, I think, with inflation in double digits, it doesn't really leave the Bank of England much choice but to hike rates again. They do say still that they expect inflation to cool across the second part of the year, but still right now inflation is just too high and it would be too risky, I think, for the Bank of England to leave it where it is.
That is Fiona Cincotta. When we get the news from the European Central Bank, we will update you. Let's bring you some other business stories. Former MasterCard boss Ajay Banga has been elected to lead the World Bank as it strives to help low-income countries overcome debt and combat climate change. He begins his 5-year term on the 2nd of June, replacing David Malpass, who sparked outcry by appearing to question the role of humans in climate change. US regulators have accused Facebook and Instagram owner Meta of not putting proper parental controls in place. The Federal Trade Commission also said Meta should be banned from making money from children's data, saying the company's recklessness has put young users at risk. Meta has called the regulator's move a political stunt and accused it of overstepping its authority. The UK's financial watchdog is planning to make it easier for companies to list their shares on the London Stock Exchange rather than in New York or elsewhere. The Financial Conduct Authority says it wants to scrap requirements which can deter startups and newer companies to make the UK more competitive with stock markets abroad. Los Angeles-based bank Pacific Western is saying it's in talks with potential partners and investors after shares in the lender and several other US regional banks hit lows. Pacific Western said it had not experienced any unusual deposit outflows since the sale of First Republic Bank to JP Morgan Chase on Monday. Shares in Pacific Western fell 52% on Wednesday. Investors remain concerned about the health of regional banks. Around the world and across the UK, this is BBC News.
Welcome to Uzbekistan, the world's secret pantry, where the rising sun fills the air with happy birdsong and the sweet scent of flowers in bloom, where vegetables are deliciously crisp and the fruit is juicy and sweet. Welcome to a world of a million flavors and textures. Uzbekistan, where everything grows. And the sunshine is a compliment.
Opportunities can be hard to find, like catching lightning in a bottle. In uncertain times, it's tempting to retreat or simply wait and see. At CME Group, we empower those who act. We deliver tools to help manage risk and capture opportunities in every market climate. across every major asset class to seize each possibility at precisely the right moment. CME Group. Opportunity is everywhere.
Hello again, you're live with BBC News. Now to Spain, where thousands of rural towns and villages are struggling for survival as people leave in search of job opportunities. Spain's Parliament has agreed to debate plans to give financial support to keep bars and cafes open, to try and stop some villages from being abandoned altogether. Guy Hedgecoe reports from central Spain.
The rural heartland of central Spain. After decades of migration towards cities, these vast agriculture-reliant areas of the country are sparsely populated. They've become known as emptied Spain. The divide between rural and urban is more pronounced here than in most European countries. 90% of Spaniards inhabit larger towns and cities. The rest are here. Nearly half of Spanish towns are at risk of depopulation. Among them is Jorcas in the Aragon region, population 36. As is the case in so many villages, the bar is the heart of the community.
It's a place for people to gather because otherwise you wouldn't see people. It means we have a meeting place.
Lots of people are involved in the bar and its maintenance creates jobs, says this woman. So bars are needed to make sure people stay and work here. But with so few customers, many rural bars are struggling.
The bar is not a viable business. We have to organize all sorts of other activities, and that's because the bar doesn't pay for itself. So you have to find other sources of income in order to make a profit, or rather, just to break even.
A political movement representing rural Spain has been campaigning for the repopulation of areas like this and calling for an improvement in public services. It's hoping to have an impact on the national political debate by performing well in upcoming local elections. The Teruel Existe party wants to make bars in towns with fewer than 200 inhabitants eligible for special economic support from the state because of the social role they play. Spain's parliament is considering the plan.
We are fighting to improve lives in our villages, to improve infrastructure, have better services, better internet connections, and improve our roads, which are very bad.
The initiative to save bars is aimed at preventing villages from suffering abandonment, which has already been the fate of so many. But those who live in emptied Spain know that the odds are still stacked against them. Guy Hedgecoe, BBC News, Jorcas.
Now to India, where its central bank, the Reserve Bank of India, says the nation will need $1 trillion in financing by 2030 to combat the effects of climate change. It comes as Indian-born Ajay Banga is elected as the new head of the World Bank, first Indian American to hold this prestigious role. The bank is trying to pivot its activities towards helping developing nations cope with climate change. Our correspondent in Delhi, Arunodai Mukherjee, has been looking into this, and he says the timing of the report is significant.
That's right, and we've been through this in our report hour so far, and the kind of reactions that we've got from various sections of the globe, where they've said that Ajay Banga is perhaps in many ways just the right candidate because there are a lot of expectations, as he is someone who can understand the needs of a developing economy like India while balancing out the commitments to green energy and also ensuring that an economy continues to grow, because that's one of the major challenges that India has faced. One is funding, and of course because of India's huge reliance on fossil fossil fuels and its attempt to try and foray into alternative means of fuel as well. India remains the third largest carbon emitter, and that's why these aspects are all the more important. And as you said, India's central bank, the Reserve Bank of India, has come out with that report in which it has red flagged certain concerns and certain ideas, saying that policy interventions are the need of the hour if India needs to achieve its net zero emission goal by 2070. For that, India needs to spend 2.5% of its GDP annually on green financing by 2030, which amounts to about $1 trillion, as you said. It has also gone ahead and said that if India does not enact policy interventions at this stage, then it could seriously impact India's gross output in the longer run and also trigger inflationary concerns in the longer run as well. India has maintained for a very long time that it is one of those countries which is disproportionately affected due to climate change, but it also needs to cater to its growing population. India has overtaken China as well in that regard. So this, of course, remains a big concern, and it would be interesting to see how things really pan out from this point onwards.
Arunadaya Mukherjee there. Well, let's look at financial markets in Asia. Of course, the European trading day gets underway in 10 minutes. A fairly mixed picture, all positive. Hong Kong up nearly 1%. Japan opened today. It was closed yesterday for a public holiday, so playing catch up. But markets digesting the Federal Reserve, its decision and the press conference. Let's look at Wall Street. The big loser on Wall Street, as we've already mentioned, PacWest shares down some 50% in after-hours trade on Wednesday. That is still a big concern for markets. But we've got Shell's results out, lots of earnings in Europe, so it'll be interesting to see how Europe starts in 10 minutes. From me, though, for now, it's goodbye.
The news never sleeps, even when you do. A ceasefire is being called. A president is being overthrown. And trials of a new cancer drug show promise. But rest, knowing you can catch up in your own time. The Global News Podcast brings you the stories you need to hear every day. Listen wherever you get your BBC podcasts.